advisor for the Latin American Caribbean and Iberian Studies program, and we're happy you could join us today. In the corner over here, there's actually a sign-in clipboard if you're interested in joining our listserv. If you're not already on there, we'd love to put you on and send you our weekly event calendar. We send it out every Thursday. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to mention another talk that we are sponsoring tomorrow that might interest some of you on a very different topic, but if some of you are reading Enrique's Journey, or if you already have as part of the Go Big View program, this speaker might interest you. We have a woman named Priscilla Guillen. She is from a Human Rights Center in Chiapas, Mexico, and she's coming to talk about human rights in the indigenous communities of Chiapas, and we'll also be talking about sort of the plight of a lot of the migrants that travel through Chiapas on their journey to the United States. So that will be tomorrow at 5:30 in the same room. So maybe you can join us for that. So today we are pleased to welcome Professor Fernando Tejedo. And Fernando is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He's going to talk about power and language, printed books, and standardization of Castilian around 1500. He teaches graduate, undergraduate courses on history of the language, dialectology, and introduction to Spanish linguistics. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And thank you very much to Lassus and to Sarah for the invitation. It's been a long time since I've been trying to answer emails, and finally I did. So and I guess that my voice projects to the end and everybody can hear me fine? All right. Just feel free to stop and interrupt or anything. I don't mind that, and I'll just try to make it as organic as possible. And the talk hopefully will last 40 minutes or so, just in case you need to go somewhere else. And I got a slight sore throat, so at some point I'll have to drink or something. All right, the topic, it's part of my research that I set aside for a while, and I'm coming back to it. It has to do with exactly those three main issues: power, language, and printed books, and all of it as it pertains to standardization. I decided to include this picture just because, not only because it's funnier, but just because it seems that this poor fellow, this monk, didn't realize that one of his greatest enemies as far as copying was, or had happened a long time ago, and it had to do with these other fellows, the printing. Printing had been from the end of the 15th century in Spain, and it came from Central Europe, mostly from Germany, and it initially was very localized. It was just German businessmen that came with their printer, and they were looking for people who might be interested in some business. It could be something related to church, or it could be someone related to perhaps the university. But somewhere around 1472 or so, Segovia finds the first printing. And as I say, they're itinerant, they're small, and they travel around. So we find many others as we progress in that century. So we find others in Seville pretty soon, or then, as I said, connected with the university. So Alcalá, Salamanca will be popping up, or even small cities such as Huete, that is somewhere around here in Cuenca. And so they could be almost everywhere, and they're just popping up everywhere since the 1470s. All right, so that's before Isabella and Fernando decided to tie the knot and join forces. And printing had been for a while, and they realized very soon, especially the church, they realized how important this new technique and this new invention was. So the king and the queen, when they came to power, they pretty quickly found out, they were keenly aware of how important that was, not only to control, but also to spread whatever messages they wanted. That means that if they had a political propaganda, the best way to spread that news was through printing. And they had had a few years since the 70s, remember, that printing had been working. So one of the first things that they do in 1480 in this council in Toledo in 1480 is when they start saying that they're really welcoming books that are printed. So they won't tax any books that are coming that are printed. And that happens already in 1480, a year after they already came into power. So they were pretty aware of the possibilities that printing was allowing or were allowing for their own purposes. Not only in any activity, but more specifically in something that they were very interested in, which was the legislative works. They had just come as a new nation. They almost had, some people say that or describe it as a civil war. So they really wanted to have a really focused and centered and united nation state. So for that, they started to publish and to print these works that were especially projecting this idea of the nation state and the power that was centralized. One of these documents that was very helpful for them, even though it didn't have that much power, but it had been used as very symbolic, and that's the whole idea, right? To project this ideology of we're all united, we're all going in the same, on the same boat, and everybody's in a peaceful state. So one of those works that I will talk about has to do with the Siete Partidas, which is the text that I've been working for quite some time now, that it was produced in the 13th century and it had been reproduced in the 14th and the 15th century. And the first printing comes in 1491. So we have now printing, which is a new technique, a new invention. We have the power, the new nation state, and they both, and those two elements are important for me as far as language. How is that important? It is important because very frequently it has been demonstrated by scholars that in that context of nation-state building, in the development of a nation-state, it also comes with the development of a standard language. That has been demonstrated in English, for French, and the idea is, or my research goes in that path, how that printing and that power, that those circles that had that power were using that with respect to language and the development of the standard language. When we think of standardization, typically we think of the matrix that was developed by Haugen in one of his seminal papers. And very briefly, when we think of standardization, we think on the one hand on the society and we think of language, but we also think of the form and the function. So society will have to select a variety that will become part of that standard, and we'll have to select those variants that will be part of that standard. And at the same time, society will have to accept or not, which is very important, that variety or those variants. The questions of how that happens is what I'm interested in. And then as far as language, codification of that form of that selected variant or that variety comes in the form of grammars, dictionaries, or perhaps even those books that become the model. So let's say literature, like a nice piece of literature that is the model of how to write, right? And then the elaboration of the function has to do with everything that will enrich the vocabulary or the language to every single function that we use the language for. So it could be not only for, let's say, for speaking, but also for writing and for the sciences and for education and for the administration, and everything will need a specific vocabulary. So that elaboration comes in the elaboration of the language, right? That's basically, those are the main ingredients of standardization. And what I'll try to show this afternoon has to do mostly with the process of selection. And specifically in one work that probably was a good model for that writing of the time. All right? Okay, so the next thing comes, what is the best way to, I guess, to study standardization or how it happens? It's very difficult to stop at a specific time and see what variant is the one that is being used mostly or not. It is much easier if we do it diachronically and we see the same structure at different times and we see whether there has been an important change or not in that structure. The best way to do it, which is not very frequently found, would be if we have the same text that it has been reproduced several times and we can compare and collate the same structure in the different manuscripts, or in my case, the different manuscripts and the printing that happens. So that's what I will attempt to show. What I will show is the different aspects of the language that will go into vocabulary and grammar, and how it shows in the manuscript tradition, and at the same time what happens when the printed came about. All right? A couple of things about this whole screen, the information that we have here. Those two guys here, they were actually brought by the Catholic monarchs from Italy. Remember that I told you how the Catholic monarchs were very interested in printing. They also brought their own printers from Italy, and they were housed in Seville. All right, so they really had this idea of how to do things. As far as the text and the manuscripts, just to give you an idea of how it works, I'm just going to do a little switcheroo here if I can. If the technology allows. Okay, so what we have here at some point are the manuscripts that I've used for that text. The Siete Partidas text has a monumental manuscript tradition. It has more than 80 manuscripts, but I've only focused on 5 of the 10 existent manuscripts of the first part. Okay, so even though that is 76 folios recto and verso, for those who are usually working with this type of manuscripts. The one that I'm using is the Fuero de las Leyes. This is a 13th century, circa 1290, and it's a draft of the Siete Partidas. This is not actually a copy. This is a draft of the text. The next manuscript that I used was a 14th century housed in El Monasterio del Escorial with the signature of Y and Roman numeral 3 and then 21. You'll see it in the document, in the data that I'll show, as Y21. This is a 14th century. The other 14th century manuscript that I'm using is the one housed in Toledo, Spain, 4313, in very good condition too. The ones from the 15th century, they're both in very good condition, housed both of them at the National Library in Madrid. This is the 22, that's the signature number that it has. And then the other one, which is interesting and important, I'll mention why, and you'll see why. This is also housed in the Biblioteca Nacional in the Vitrina 4-6. And this is important because this was also sponsored by a nobleman in Aragon. He specifically wanted a copy of the text and put a lot of money, as you can see in all the decorations that it has, and how it has everything that you can think of. It has some features, some traits of Aragonese in the first part, but it will become important for us, as you will see. All right, so this one is also a 15th century, and this text was also given as a present to the Catholic monarchs. So if you go now to the copy, you'll see that it has a Catholic monarch seal. It was a gift, and I'm pretty sure that it was also used as a reference for Montalvo. All right, so give me a second here to do And I think I have a problem. I have a problem, Houston. I do. All right. I think I'm going to be able to sort it out. It just went blank on me. It's coming back.
Oh, okay.
Okay, here we go. Good. All right, so we go back to the manuscripts and the text, and these are the ones that you will see in the data that I will show. Okay, so let's go on. So let's see what this description or the typical characterization of Castilian of the 15th century is in the scholarship. All right? And what we find, and this is what is of interest to me, is, for instance, this type of description, for instance, with La Pesa describing that golden period, mucho más seguro que el de la Edad Media, era sin embargo un idioma en evolución muy activa. And what is interesting to me is when he says that texto en multitud de ejemplares en las anárquicas variantes de la transmisión manuscrita. What is interesting to me is how all of a sudden language has its own life, because el español es mucho más seguro, right? And we'll see how that is very typical of many descriptions, that all of a sudden the language is as if it has its own life and it's looking for something, you know? And we see the same thing with when we find descriptions of meaning. So in this case, Corrales Tumbado will say, el tránsito de la Edad Media a la moderna es una mayor fijeza de las lexías que quedarán mucho más limitadas en sus usos. And we'll see if that is so, or why is that, or why we have that perception. What my hypothesis is, or not hypothesis, but my understanding is that these authors might be actually influenced by the ideology of the standard. And they see things as what they look like, but in fact is more a question of standardization influencing our perspective on the history of the language. And the last that I will touch upon later on has to do with morphology. And again, we have this idea, la lengua no se siente muy segura, it has its own life apparently, con los nombres formados en miento sobre verbos de la primera conjugación y busca otras terminaciones que le ofrezcan una mayor firmeza. So that idea of the Dark Ages, and then in the Golden Age we have something more fixed, more accurately presented, is all over the place. Let's see what happens with the data. Okay, so we have, I'll pay attention to three elements of vocabulary, and we'll see the type of switches that we find. So this will be the manuscript, the 13th century manuscript, and this will be the printed version. And just for the sake of saving space, I'm just presenting that. And then the readings of the manuscripts at the bottom. So we find sabor, en tan gran sabor de labrar ni de criar. And then we find the change, grande voluntad de labrar ni de criar. We don't find much of a change besides the orthographic variation, which is not relevant for us at this point. And we do find that manuscript that I was telling you about, that was sponsored by the nobleman and it had been taken care of very carefully, how it introduces a change that is actually copied by the printed version. Right? So in this case, we could say, okay, maybe it is that the word sabor by the end of the 15th century was becoming old, and then that's why the manuscript changed it, and then the printed followed up on that. But if we see other examples where we find sabor, en prelados hayan sabor de guardarles sus privilegios, and we find another change, and in this case, all of the manuscript tradition doesn't change, except for a few orthographical changes. So it's not necessarily that it wasn't used, or that it was not accepted, or that they didn't like it. It's that the printed version is actually changed it severely. We'll see another example. In this case, we have sabor, and then it is changed by placer. And then again, we don't find any major change except for the orthographic variation and the omission in the manuscript from the 15th century. One more example. And again, we find the same word, había en sabor de dejar, and a change now using another word that the printed version had already used, and no change in the manuscript tradition. All right, so this means what we need to be asking is whether sabor was actually used or not around that time when the printed version came off the presses. And if we look at that documentation, we'll find that sabor is still documented in mid-16th century, or even after in the second half of the 15th century, or we could find it in the typical habían almorzado a su sabor y a sus anchas, which is very similar to the cases that we have found back in the manuscripts and in the printed version that didn't accept. And we can even find it in the 20th century as a su sabor, right? So here we have a case of manipulation very drastically and dramatically, because it's almost every time that that word appears, it is substituted by another one. And a wide variety of possibilities. It's not just substituted by any other, but just the same one, but different ones. All right, let's see what happens with another example here, the second case with vocabulary. We have guisado, and we have según tuviere por guisado, and the change in the printed version, según tuviere por derecho. And we see that there is no change in the manuscript edition. Nothing happens. So they accept it, it seems. We look for another one, and we find guisado, and then we find justo, and then we don't find any change in the manuscript edition. At this point, we might be thinking, well, maybe it was an old word by the time the printed version was, they were working on it, and maybe they decided to modernize. So we'll find another example here, and then we find guisado, and then again, now changed by razonable, no change in the manuscript edition. And finally, we find guisado again, and then another change. Now is suficiente, and then no change in the manuscript edition. If we go to the documentation around the 1500, we might find another case here, guisado por mesura. If we omit this change, which probably the scribe had, I don't know, maybe just distracted, or just the manuscript was not in good condition. Whatever the reason, it was a bad reading. But we find the same reading in the manuscripts and a change in the printed version. And I think the last one, which is an interesting one, where we find guisado in the manuscript and we find perteneciente. If we go to the manuscript tradition, then we find where that comes from. Because there's no change here, and then this manuscript, the one that I was telling you about, they wanted to eliminate this one, but they kept it and they included the change. And then the printed version, they picked up on that, and then they eliminated the word, and then they put it correctly according to what they thought that it had to go. All right, so if we go to the documentation, we'll find guisado all over the place from the 15th century, the end of the 15th century, but also the 17th century, or even mid-15th century, ya todo guisado, in the same type of, or parallel meanings. So again, this is not a question of just eliminating a word that didn't have any use, or that it was old, or that they wouldn't understand. It was just the preference of the editors to change dramatically all of those words and substitute it by many other alternatives, because it's not substituting it by just one, but many different ones, which is also important, as I will mention in just a second. All right, if we go to the last example in vocabulary, when we find gran femencia, which nowadays we'll say emencia, although it is true that not that many people find that in their vocabulary, or their active vocabulary, maybe in their passive, or maybe in the written register, probably. but it's still something that we can find in the dictionaries for sure in the 20th century or the 21st. And then the substitution that we find is diligencia. And then the manuscript edition doesn't show any trace of change at all. If we look for another example, then we would find the same type of substitution in the printed version and no change in the manuscript edition. And then finally, we would find the same situation in the last example, in this case with puerta again, and no change in the manuscript edition. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that the editors worked very hard and thoroughly in that text. It was just not a question of modernizing the text. It was actually enriching the text for the wide dissemination. They were using, if we go back to the type of changes that they, and the words that they were using for those changes, we'll find many neologisms or Latinisms. So those words such as diligencia, suficiente, words of that type, those are Latinisms. And then we would find also words that are new entry or recent entry in the vocabulary, such as razonable. So they were doing it carefully, and they were doing according to specific preferences. It was very conscious. It was not something mechanic that they were doing. So this is what's going on with the vocabulary. Let's see what happens with the grammar pretty quickly, and which is more the same, but with some other points that I'd like to mention. Again, if we were going to the documentation, we would find examples.
So today we are pleased to welcome Professor Fernando Tejedo. And Fernando is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He's going to talk about our language, printed books, and standardization of Castilian around 1500. He teaches graduate, undergraduate courses on history of the language, dialectology, and introduction to Spanish linguistics. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And thank you very much to Lastus and to Sarah for the invitation. It's been a long time since I've been trying to answer emails, and finally I did. So and I guess that my voice projects to the end and everybody can hear me fine? All right. Just feel free to stop and interrupt or anything. I don't mind that, and I'll just try to make it as organic as possible. And the talk hopefully will last 40 minutes or so, just in case you need to go somewhere else. And I got a slight sore throat, so at some point I'll have to drink or something. All right, the topic, it's part of my research that I set aside for a while, and I'm coming back to it. It has to do with exactly those three main issues: power, language, and printed books, and all of it as it pertains to standardization. I decided to include this picture just because, not only because it's funnier, but just because it seems that this poor fellow, this monk, didn't realize that one of his greatest enemies as far as copying was, or had happened a long time ago, and it had to do with these other fellows, the printing.
Tomorrow that might interest some of you on a very different topic, but if some of you are reading Enrique's Journey, or if you already have as part of the Go Big View program, the speaker might interest you. We have a woman named Priscilla Guien. She is from a Human Rights Center in Chiapas, Mexico, and she's coming to talk about human rights in the indigenous communities of Chiapas, and we'll also be talking about sort of the plight of a lot of the migrants that travel through Chiapas on their journey to the United States. So that will be tomorrow at 5:30 in the same room. So maybe you can join us for that. Okay, hello. Thanks for coming. My name is Sarah Riff. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American Caribbean and Iberian Studies program, and we're happy you could join us today. In the corner over here, there's actually a sign-in clipboard if you're interested in joining our listserv. If you're not already on there, we'd love to put you on and send you our weekly event calendar. We send it out every Thursday. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to mention another talk that we are sponsoring